$1,000 commission. Okay, so we're going to get started in just a second, and I apologize if somebody is going to come in later and we may have to work back a little bit. All right, so number one is a buyer's interest in real property acquired at the moment the seller and the buyer enter into a sales contract. And by the way, that's when we have an executory contract. And when we have an executory contract, our answer is we have an equitable title. So we have equitable title at that point. And we're still admitting people. So equitable title. Number two, let's see what's going on here. The number to text to get a copy of the test is 732-266-3366. 732-266-3366. Number two, by the way, we have an executory contract when buyer and seller have agreed. We have an executed contract when it closes, but at the very moment when they first come to an agreement, they have a meeting of the minds. The buyer actually has a form of ownership known as equitable title or equitable ownership interest. Number two, in order to spread the tax load and provide employment, a combination of residential, commercial, and industrial property is usually included in a city's master plan. The master plan is required of all cities in New Jersey. Each city has to have a master plan. They create that via the planning board. The planning board has to have 7 or 9 members. Number three, a buyer enters a verbal contract to purchase a house and immediately gives the broker an earnest check for $500. Now that's important because we are establishing that we do have a contract here. That's important because you are establishing that we do have a contract here. And it says prior to performance. Now what does prior to performance mean? At closing, we have performance. So at closing, the contract is an executed contract, but it says prior to performance. Now it's asking this oral or verbal contract is considered legally and it's legally enforceable. And it's legally enforceable because of a change to the statute of frauds that makes an oral contract for real estate enforceable as long as there's evidence to the nature and the extent of the transaction. And that's what that $500 kind of represents. Okay, number four, under a lease for a commercial property, a tenant agrees to pay $4,000 per month plus 3% of the monthly sales. That kind of a lease is called a percentage lease. And in shopping centers, most of the smaller stores along the corridors have percentage leases. Number five, proper recordation of documents affecting the title and interest to real estate legally provides constructive notice. So we record things in order to get constructive knowledge or constructive notice. And that's because we're a buyer beware state, and it's up to the buyer to find out everything about a property, including who was the real owner. And how do they find out who was the real owner? They go to the county clerk's office and they do a title search. So recording a document serves as constructive notice. Number six, somebody missing a letter here. A knows and operates a restaurant in a recently annexed by a nearby city. As part of the annexation, the area was zoned for single-family residences, but K is allowed to continue operating the restaurant under the city's zoning ordinance. This allowance for K is commonly known as a pre-existing non-conforming use, also known as grandfathered. It's also known as grandfathered. So it's a pre-existing non-conforming use, also known as grandfathering. Number seven, under leverage is considered to be which of the following processes. So think of a lever, and your lever is something that has a fulcrum and then has a lever, and then it exerts a force, and the fulcrum, the lever, the distance from the fulcrum to the end of the lever gives you extra extra force up, depending on the relationship between how long the one side of the lever is and how short the other side is. So what is leverage in real estate? It's controlling a large asset with a small amount of cash. That's what leverage means, is you're controlling a large asset with a small amount of cash. That's one of the advantages of real estate, that you can do that. One of the disadvantages of real estate, by the way, is that the money is not liquid. If you've got your money tied up in a house and you suddenly need money, you can't just go and, tear off a couple of pipes and go sell them. So it's not a liquid asset, but it is considered to be leverage, controlling a large asset with a small amount of cash. Somebody have a question? Okay, the next one's a little tricky. So you can count on it being the test. A salesperson is taking a listing on a house that has 2,000 square feet of living area on a 1-acre lot. The seller, the owner, insists that the listing price should be $30 per square foot plus $15,000 for the lot, and with a 6% sales commission. What does he have to sell it for? So let's look at what he's trying to net. He's trying to net 2,000 square feet times $30 per square foot. So that's $60,000 plus $15,000 for the lot. So he's trying to net $75,000. And the way we solve this is we take $75,000 and we divide it by the additive inverse of the commission. The additive inverse of the commission is 0.94. What additive inverse means is what plus 0.06 is going to give you 1, and what plus 106 is going to give you 1 is 0.94. So if you take 75,000 and divide it by 0.94, it's going to give you 79,787 as the answer. So the answer is going to be 79,787. Now, if you wanted to check that, what you would do is let's just work all the numbers backwards. Take 79,787, subtract the 6% sales commission, and it's going to leave you $75,000. Okay. When the capitalization rate is used for appraising income-producing property is lowered, when the cap rate is lowered, what happens to the value of the property? And so that's asking you if you remember the formula, which is value by income is equal to net operating income divided by the cap rate. Okay, that's the formula. So here's the cap rate, it's the denominator here. If we reduce the cap rate, what happens to value? Well, because they have an inverse proportion, because the cap rate is on the denominator, if you reduce the cap rate, the value goes up. Okay, it's one of the reasons that contributes to the values going up so fast on houses now is that the interest rate is so low. So again, when the cap rate goes down, the value goes up. When the cap rate goes up, the value goes down. It's an inverse relationship because cap rate is on the denominator and value on the other side is on what is essentially the numerator. So again, when the capitalization rate is lowered, what happens to the value of the property? The value of the property increases. Number 10, a federal law that requires a lender to inform the borrower of the true cost of lending is the Truth in Lending Act. Part of the Truth in Lending Act requires Regulation Z. Part of Regulation Z is that APR. The Real Estate Sale and Procedures Act tells us how we have to fill out our closing statement. The Federal Equal Credit Opportunity Act tells us that we can't require people to be on birth control to get a loan, and we can't require people to have a telephone in their own name to get a loan. And the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act is if you've got 100 residential properties in another state and you're trying to sell them in New Jersey, that Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act covers those particular types of properties. Okay, M has given J power of attorney to act as attorney in fact to sell M's property. In this situation, which of the following statements is correct? So M's given J power of attorney. So let's look at the possible answers. The power of attorney empowers J to sign a deed conveying title to M's property, even if the attorney does not contain this specific statement. That's not true, because in a power of attorney that you're granting to deal with real estate, it has to be what's called a special power of attorney, and it has to be specifically referring to the property that you're going to sign the deed for, and it has to be in writing. So A is not true. B, the power of attorney must be in writing if it grants J the power to sign a sales contract on behalf of M. Well, that's what we just said. It's got to be in writing in order to grant the power to sign on behalf of M. Number 12, which of the following clauses is likely to be included in a blanket loan? And a blanket loan has a release clause. Remember, a blanket loan is what you're using if you're a developer.
Sorry, Bruce, to
Yes.
interrupt, but which questions are these? Where is this some new questions?
These are questions I sent out last week for people to look at while I was away last week. If you don't have this test, right now, text to my wife and tell her to please send it to you right now. 732 266, and you got 266-3366. When you text her, make sure you include your email address, and she will send it to you right now. So I'll just wait a second while you do that. I'll take a break for a second.
That's okay. No problem. Thank you.
Okay. So again, let's go back to what is a release clause. It's when a builder is building a couple of houses and he's going to get one lien to cover all the houses. So now as he finishes this house and he wants to sell it, he needs it to be released from under the blanket loan. And so it has a release clause that allows this to come out from the loan, from the lien, and be released and be sold. So that's a blanket mortgage. A blanket mortgage has a release clause. Number 13, a lender would most likely rely on which of the following approaches to value when underwriting a mortgage on an apartment complex. So we have three kinds of methods for appraisals: comparable sales, income, and cost. And we know that an apartment, we're looking at income. We're looking at the income approach on an apartment. For a church, we'd be looking at the cost approach. For a regular house, we'd look at the market data or direct sales comparison approach. So again, those are the three forms, but you would use the income approach for an apartment building. And remember, the value by income, we talked about this a minute ago, in the income approach, the value by income is the net operating income divided by the cap rate. Okay. Which of the following fees is least likely to be paid by a condominium owner? And we know that a condominium owner is going to pay maintenance fees. We know they're going to pay hazard fees. Your homeowners, your policy for your insurance, and you know they're going to pay a homeowners association fee. What are they not going to pay? A stock transfer fee. Because who pays a stock transfer fee? A condominium owner. I'm sorry, not a condominium, a co-op owner. A co-op owner pays a stock transfer fee. A co-op owner has shares of stock in a co-op corporation and a proprietary lease. Number 15, the purpose of an option contract is, and it's to keep open an offer to sell. Remember, an option contract, only the seller has to perform, and the buyer gets to perform at his option if he wants to. So we're keeping open that offer that the seller made to sell and letting the buyer decide if he wants to move forward or not. That's an option contract. An option contract is also—
Bruce, I'm sorry to interrupt again, but can you share the first 12 questions answer quickly?
Absolutely. Only because you asked nice and you've been a good student. So,
Thank you. Thank you.
Can you see them? Number 1 is B.
Yes.
Number 2 is B. Number 3 is D. Number 4 is C. Number 5 is A. Number 6 is D. Number 7 is A. Number 8 is D. Number 9 is B. Number 10 is C, the Truth in Lending Act. Number 11 is B. Number 12 is A. Number 13 is B. Number 14 is B. Number 15 is C. And again,
Thank you.
if you don't have the test, text my wife right now your
I
email
did.
address
I
and she'll
did.
send it to you. I got to keep her busy.
I did text her. Thank you.
You're welcome. Which of the following agreements gives the broker the maximum protection of a commission? And that means which is the one that I like the best, and it's an exclusive right to sell. That's the one where no matter who finds the buyer, I get my commission. On an open listing, if another real estate office finds the buyer, I get no commission. On an exclusive agency listing, if the seller finds his own buyer, I get no commission. And a net listing is illegal. So it's an exclusive right to sell. That's the kind I like the best. Which of the following loans is least likely to be classified as a second mortgage? So a wraparound mortgage is always a second mortgage. A seller-assisted mortgage is always a second mortgage. An equity loan is typically a second mortgage, and this is saying which is least likely, and the least likely one is a construction loan. Excuse me. Number 18, a property management agreement normally includes, and the very first thing the property management agreement should include is a description of the manager's fiduciary or fiscal responsibilities. Everything else goes into the operating statement or the operating plan. But the management agreement, where the person who owns the building appoints the agent as his agent, that needs to be in a description of the manager's fiscal responsibilities, their fiduciary responsibilities. Number 19, a listing in which many brokers are given a listing is known as an open listing. Now, open listings are not in the MLS because it's given to many brokers. So they would, if you gave and allowed open listings in the MLS and you gave it to many brokers, then many brokers would enter it into the MLS and you'd have the same property listed 200 times. 20, it would be appropriate for a broker to assist a buyer in obtaining financing by, so we cannot complete the loan application. We cannot prepare the mortgage and the note. That's the attorney's job. We cannot prepare the RESPA. That's the closing agent's job. But we can explain various loan programs for the buyer. Number 21, a restrictive covenant is best defined as which of the following types of property control? So a restrictive covenant is something that the grantor has put into the deed that says, you know, you can't use your property to grow cattle because I don't want cows next to me. So it's a contractual limitation on ownership. It's not a government limitation. The government limitation is PEAT, police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and is cheat. And it's not an easement or adverse possession. Those are both, an easement is in the deed, and adverse possession is a way that you could lose your property or somebody could claim title to your property if they openly, notoriously, and continuously occupy the property. So a restrictive covenant is contractual limitations on ownership. Number 22, when value estimates are derived from cost, direct sales, and income approach, that's how you do an appraisal, all three methods, and the results are relatively close in dollar amount, what should the appraiser do to obtain a final value estimate? So what he's got to do is he has got to reconcile. That's the last step, is reconcile the three estimates. It's not average, it's not the highest, and it's not the least appropriate and average. What you're doing when you're reconciling is you're using a weighted average to determine which of those values most clearly indicates the value of the subject. Number 23, The licensee is commingling trust funds by depositing. So when you're commingling, what are you doing wrong? You're mixing trust funds with the business account funds. So let's look at them. Which one of these is commingling? So earnest monies received from a client's properties in the agency's business account. Well, that's what you're not allowed to do. You are allowed to have different clients' monies in the same trust account. You only have one trust account. And if you have your own properties, you could put the money into your own account. And we have tenant security deposits received from various clients in the same escrow trust account. You can't do that. Remember, each tenant has to have their own individual tenant account set up. And you have to have, when you have a tenant and you set up their trust account, it's under their name, under their social security number, and you have to tell them where it is within 30 days. Number 24, a buyer purchases a furnished condominium apartment as an investment. The document that evidences the buyer's ownership of the furniture is a bill of sale. And remember, there is a kind of mortgage that lets you use both the real property, the building itself, and the furniture, the personal property, as collateral for the loan. That's called a package mortgage. So if you were buying a furnished condominium as an investment, you'd get a deed for the building and you'd get a bill of sale for the furniture. And if you were trying to use both the building and the furniture as collateral, you would get a package mortgage. Number 25, which of the following leases would best protect the interest of a lessee from a lessor's desire to terminate the lease? And it's a tenancy for years. Now, a tenancy for years doesn't necessarily mean it's going to last a year. A tenancy for years means that it has a beginning date and an ending date, and you're both going to stick with the beginning date and the ending date, both the landlord and the tenant. Number 25, a broker suggests that sellers sign a listing agreement that gives the broker's office sole permission to sell the property for 90 days. But the seller wants to be able to sell it themselves without paying a commission. So what kind of a listing should they get? That's an exclusive agency listing. And that's where the seller reserves the right to sell it themselves and not pay a commission. G buys a property from T, who agrees.
Bruce,
Yes.
it's all, I'm sorry, the open listing also seller reserves the right?
Right, but that's not in here. That's not one of the, yes.
No, I know, I'm
right.
just saying, yeah.
Yes, in an open listing, the seller reserves the right to sell it themselves and not pay a commission. That's exactly right. Good job. 27, G buys a property from T.
So,
yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just to piggyback off of what she just said, what's the difference between the two then?
So,
if they mean the same exact thing.
Except in an open listing, so let's say the VA, and that's who usually uses open listings, has open listings for properties that they foreclosed on. And whoever finds the buyer for that property gets all the commission. So that means that there's no splitting commissions, because whoever found the buyer gets all the commission. And the seller reserves the right to sell it themselves and not pay a commission. Now, that's the open listing. An exclusive agency listing, if any real estate agency is involved in finding the buyer, then the commission has to be paid. But if there's no real estate agency involved in finding the buyer, that would mean that the seller found their own buyer, then there's no commission. So this is a question that people ask a lot. And so you got to think of it that what exclusive agency means is this is the kind of listing that says if we're exclusive of any real estate agency being involved in the transaction, then there's no commission. And how would that happen? How would there be no real estate agency involved in the transaction? The seller would be selling it themselves. I don't know if that helps, but that's sometimes the explanation.
No, it did. Thank you.
Okay. 27, G buys a property from T, who agrees to finance part of the purchase price for 15 years, and he's not going to give the title until the final payment is made. And this is called a contract for deed or a land contract. And that's a really bad way for a buyer to buy a house, because if a buyer buys that house if a buyer buys a house that method and he misses the first payment of the 14th year, he loses all of his equity. Contract for deed is a very risky way to buy a house. Now, somebody just asked if I could go back for a question for a second. Let's get back to it. And 16 and 17 we're looking for. 16 is D, exclusive right to sell, and 17 is C, construction. Property owner sells a house to a buyer and agrees to finance $10,000 of the purchase price on an installment note. So what we're saying here now is that the seller is going to hold a mortgage. Let's see if I get that mark off of there. There we go. The seller is going to hold a mortgage. So how is that shown on the closing statement? Well, if the seller is going to hold a mortgage for $10,000, the seller's check at closing is going to be smaller by $10,000. So we know it's going to be a debit to the seller. And if the seller is going to hold a mortgage for $10,000, that's $10,000 less that the buyer has to bring to closing. So the buyer's wheelbarrow full of money is $10,000 lighter. So it's going to be a credit to the buyer. So a seller held mortgage is a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer. So a credit to the buyer and a debit to the seller. 29, the owner of an apartment building has received an offer to purchase. If a clause in the tenant's lease requires the owner to give the tenant an opportunity to match the offer, the clause is called, and it's called a right of first refusal. And a right of first refusal is not as good as an option. Because an option, you've agreed to a price, you have agreed to an option period, you've agreed to option consideration, and it means the buyer actually could force the seller to sell it to him. But with a right of first refusal, if the seller decides he's not going to honor the right of first refusal, all the buyer could do is sue him for a contractual obligation. So somebody wanted to see number 28 again, and again, the seller is holding a $10,000 mortgage for the buyer. The seller's check is going to be $10,000 smaller because he's not getting that $10,000 right now. And the buyer's wheelbarrow full of money is going to be $10,000 lighter because that money that the seller is financing is that much less money that the buyer has to bring to closing. So it's going to be a credit to the buyer because his wheelbarrow is lighter and a debit to the seller because his final check is going to be smaller by $10,000. Number 30, a state housing finance corporation makes mortgages available to qualified borrowers at an annual rate of 8.5% plus 10% down. If a broker makes reference to this source of financing when advertising real estate property, which one of these things is going to trigger full disclosure? And what triggers full disclosure is no qualifying statements. And if they say financing available with 10% down, that's no qualifying statements. And what that means is everybody would have the ability to infer that if they just came up with 10% down, they could get the interest rate. That's why you need a full disclosure because it might not be available to everybody. 31, when the parties to a contract stipulate that a specified sum must be paid by any party who breaches the contract, that's called liquidated damages. And we do not have automatic liquidated damages in New Jersey. If you want to have liquidated damages, you have to have it in the contract and it has to stipulate it. And typically attorneys for regular deals won't stand up for this. It's too risky for the buyer. Where we do see liquidated damages quite often is with new home sales, like with Canadian Homes or Toll Brothers. They have liquidated damages clause. 32, when land is held, and this should say fee simple absolute, that's the highest form of fee simple of freehold ownership, and a sole owner dies leaving no will, the owner's title passes in accordance with and it's the law of intestate distribution. And intestate means no will. And if the person had no will and no heirs, no will and no heirs, then the property would escheat to the state. But if he has a will, then the property goes to whoever the will calls it to go for. If he has heirs but no will, the property goes via the law of intestate distribution, and the chart is in your book. And if he dies with no will and no heirs, it goes to the state through escheat. 33, compensation to a broker for property management is usually a percentage of gross income. It's usually a percentage of gross income. And it's typically 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%. Just depends on what you have to do and what you charge. 34, in the absence of a formal appraisal report, which of the following choices would be most appropriate for setting a listing price in a new, rapidly selling neighborhood? And it would be the price that willing buyers have recently paid for similar structures, since this price reflects the market. $35, an unmarried couple wants to buy a house and take title so that when one of them dies, the dead person's share will go to the dead person's heirs. So we know it's not joint tenancy, because in joint tenancy, the share goes to the surviving tenant. So we know it's not joint tenancy. We know it's not tenancy by the entirety, because that's the same thing happens then too. So it has to be tenancy in common. It has to be tenancy in common. And we wanted to go back for a second. You said to 34. 34 is A. House is 34 by 42. You're welcome. House is 34 by 42. It's on a lot that's 3,500. The house would have a current reproduction value of $21 per square foot. To the nearest 1,000, what is the current value of the property? So we're going to take 34 and multiply it by 42. That's 1,428. So our house is 1,428 square feet. It's 1,428 square feet. And we're going to multiply that by $21, because it's $21 per square foot. And that gives us 2,988. Okay. Now we got a problem, because when we do the cost approach, and this is the cost approach, we have to subtract accrued depreciation. And the first part of accrued depreciation is wear and tear. And so they're telling us here that we have wear and tear of 75 cents per square foot of the roof. So we're going to take 1,428 and we're going to multiply it by 0.75. So that means we have $1,071 depreciation for wear and tear. So we're going to subtract that from the 29,988. And now we add back in the value of the land. And you never depreciate land because it doesn't depreciate. So if we take 29,988 and we subtract 1071, and then we add in 3,500. So 29,988 minus 1071, and then plus 3,500. Our answer is 32,417. And the closest to that is 32,000. On the real test, they'll never give you a number that doesn't come out exactly. So if your number doesn't come out exactly, you did a mistake. 37, in a real estate sale, the purpose of the title commitment is a formal...
Bruce, you had two options marked on 35 or 36, sorry.
But
35.
32 is the closest though.
No, 35, you have two options marked. So which one is correct? 35.
Let's do it again. So we have 34 times 42. That's equal to...
No. I'm talking about 35. I think the correct
answer. The answer is B. The D was just a slip of the pen.
Yeah.
The D was
Okay.
just B. The D was a slip of the pen. I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Okay, in a real estate sale, the purpose of the title commitment. The title commitment is a formal agreement that says a title insurance company will issue the title insurance at closing. So indicate the title insurance company will insure the title. A lessee is released from the obligation to pay rent. Well, if the property is sold, he's got to pay rent. If he gets transferred, he's got to pay rent. If he takes off in the middle of the night, he's got to pay rent. He owes the rent. But if there is a constructive eviction, the premises are condemned for health reasons, that's a constructive eviction, then he's relieved of his obligation of the rest of the rent. So the answer is D. 39, which of the following statements about a mortgaged property is correct? This is testing to see if you know who is the mortgagor and who is the mortgagee. The mortgagor is the borrower. The mortgagee is the bank. So let's look at some of these answers. The mortgagee, that's the bank. Do they have title to the property? Not in our state, so that's a wrong answer. C, the mortgagee retains the usual rights of ownership. Well, the bank doesn't own your house. B, a lien is created in favor of the mortgagor. Does the lien help the borrower any? No, the lien protects the seller. So the only answer left that could be right is the mortgagor may sell the property. And if we remember, the mortgagor is the borrower, and of course the borrower can sell the property. So it's the mortgagor can sell the property. Number 40, the primary function of Fannie Mae. And again, the primary function to Fannie Mae. So what does Fannie Mae do? It buys mortgages in the secondary market. And what's the purpose of doing that? It's to assure liquidity. And why do they care about assuring liquidity? Because having the availability of capital is part of the demand in the economic principles of value, which is DUS, demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. So Fannie Mae buys mortgages in the secondary market. 41, S, the owner of a condominium unit, requests TZA unit Realty to sell the unit. When TZA presents S with a listing agreement, he says he wants a clause in there that says you can't sell it to a more minority person. What should you do? Well, you have to refuse to take the listing if they're insisting on having that clause. 42, which of the following factors would be included in the description of replacement cost? So when we're doing the cost approach, remember the first thing we have to decide is, are we doing reproduction or replacement? Reproduction is an exact duplicate. Replacement is current materials, similar utility, and current design. So looks like A is the answer. Similar utility, current material, and design is replacement. 43, if a rural subdivision loses the benefit of fire protection from the nearby city, which of the following forms of depreciation best describes the loss in value? So this again is a cost approach. And remember the three parts of cost approach is you're going to find what it's going to cost you to build your imaginary building, and then you're going to subtract accrued depreciation, and that's wear and tear, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence. And so if you lose your fire department, it reduces the value of your home and there's nothing you can do about it. That's external obsolescence. Physical deterioration, is it wearing out? Functional obsolescence, is it performing? Functional obsolescence is it's outdated or outmoded. And external obsolescence is something on the outside that reduces value, like losing your fire department or high tension wires going over your property. 44, if a property owner gives an interested party a properly executed option with December 31st as the expiration date, and then he dies before that date, well, unfortunately, what he is doing with an option contract is he's actually giving a maybe form of ownership to the optionee. So therefore, it's going to remain enforceable. It's going to remain enforceable. In the course of a busy day, a broker has received 3 earnest money checks under executed sales contracts for 3 listed properties. What does the broker do? So what the broker has to do is the broker has to deposit all 3 checks in the broker's escrow account under separate headings. So all 3 of the checks have to go into broker's trust account. Remember, only the broker can have a trust account. Remember, all those escrow deposits have to be deposited in the trust account within 5 business days or they become stale. Salesperson is on a 50-50 split with his agency. He sells a 300-acre farm at $1,200 per acre. The salesman is only working for the buy side. The commission is 5%, 2.5% to the listing, 2.5% to the buy side. What's his commission going to be? So first we're going to do 300 times 1,200. So the sales price is going to be $360,000. And the buy side of the transaction is going to be that times 0.025. And that's $9,000. That's the total commission coming in to the office. And he's on a 50-50 split. So 50-50 of 9,000 is $4,500. So the salesman's going to get $4,500. Number 47, which of the following statements about a real estate sales contract is correct? So let's go through the answers. The contract conveys legal title to the property when it's been signed by both parties. No, it doesn't. It doesn't give legal title. It gives an equitable title. So it's not A. The contract binds both parties to complete the sale within a given period of time. So it doesn't bind them to both complete within a given period of time. There is a closing date that's on a contract. And if you want that closing date to be real important and have to close on that, you'd need to have a time is of the essence paragraph. Both parties have the right to specific performance. And what that means is that both parties have the right to go to court and force the other property to do what they said. That's the answer. D is wrong. It says the broker may keep the earnest money deposit if the buyer defaults. That's not necessarily true, right? If we had liquidated damages, the seller would get to keep the earnest money deposit, but the broker never gets to keep the earnest money deposit. Number 48, which of the following phrases is least likely to be found in a brochure marketing a timeshare? So we call them prepaid vacations, we call them interval ownership, we call them floating use plans. There's no such thing as an escalation plan. They just threw that in there. So that is our answer. 49. While observing market conditions, a property manager should be aware that an increased demand for rental property, what all of a sudden makes everybody trying to rent instead of buy, is an increase in mortgage rates. An increase in mortgage rates makes everybody try to rent because they can't afford to buy. Number 50, a net lease, that's usually in a commercial building. A net lease is where the tenant pays a flat fee plus his share of the real estate taxes. So he would get a deduction for real estate taxes. The lessee, the tenant, would get a deduction for real estate taxes. 51, which of the following statements about a valid option contract is correct? So which ones are correct? Let's look at A. The optionee may not assign the option contract. Well, he can if he's got permission. B, it allows the optionor to sell to another party at a higher rate. No, it doesn't, because the optionor cannot sell it. The optionor has to wait until the option period is up. The optionee must purchase the property. No, he doesn't have to. The optionee purchases it at his own judgment. And D, if the option is not exercised, then the optionor retains the option consideration. That's the answer. Remember, the 3 things you need for an option contract is a named price, option consideration, and an option period. And if the buyer doesn't buy it during the option period, the seller gets to keep the option consideration. So if the option is not exercised, the optionor, that's the seller, retains the option consideration.
Could you explain what exactly an option is?
Sure. It's a unilateral contract, which means only one party has to perform. So you've got a seller who's got a house and he wants to sell it, and you don't see option contracts now because the market's too hot. So here's our seller, he's got a house he wants to sell. Here's our buyer who wants to buy it. And the buyer's not sure if he wants to buy it, and the seller is not getting any other offers on the property like it was back in 2008 when you couldn't sell anything. So the buyer's thinking he might want to buy it. The seller is getting real scared, because he doesn't think he's ever going to get an offer. So the buyer, in an option contract, the buyer makes an offer. It has to be a named price. Let's say it's $200,000. There's a named price. That's a $200,000. He has 1 year in the option, and that period can be any amount of time, but let's just say it's 1 year. And for the right to have this option contract, he's going to give the seller $1,000 now in option consideration. So we have a named price, we have an option period, we have option consideration. Now, anytime during the year that the buyer wants to buy it, all he's got to do is tell the seller, I'm buying it, and the seller has to sell it to him. If the buyer never decides he wants to sell it, at the end of the option period, at the end of the year, if the buyer never decides he wants the seller to sell it to him, at the end of the year, if the buyer never exercises his option, then the seller gets to keep the $1,000. And once the year is over, then the seller is free to sell it to anyone else he chooses. Now, we don't see that now. Go ahead.
So during that 1 year period, if the seller had received other offers, he can't sell it to them.
He can't sell. Now, the question I always ask people is, sellers aren't always honest. So if you're a buyer and you have an option contract that allows you to have a year to decide if you're going to buy it or not, how do you keep the seller from selling it to other people? How do you make sure the seller doesn't sell it to other people? And the answer is you would record your option, because if you recorded your option, if your seller tried to sneak and sell it to someone else, when that person went to do their title search, they would see the recorded option and they wouldn't give title insurance.
All right, thank you.
So options are most useful in a horrible market, in a down market, right? Because think about it, if you're the buyer and you have an option contract and you gave the seller $1,000 for the option consideration, and during the year the house went way down in value, the house lost $100,000 in value, since you've got an option, you don't have to buy it. If you're the buyer, you can say, oh, so sorry it went down in value, I'm out of here. So it works really well in a down market. It's unheard of in an up market.
Got you.
All right, which of the following descriptions best summarizes the essential characteristics of a condominium ownership? So in a condominium ownership, you have individually owned units. You own from the walls in fee simple, and the common areas are owned as tenants in common. And those tenants in common areas have reference to a declaration. So you have an individually owned unit and jointly owned common areas. So your unit you own from the walls in, the hallways and the stairs, they're owned as tenants in common. And if you remember, tenants in common has equal rights of possession. So that would allow all the other condominium owners to use the halls and the parking lot and the stairways. 53, which of the following information about a property must be included in a listing agreement? And it has to have an adequate description of it. Okay. What else has to be in a listing agreement? The price. What else has to be in a listing agreement? The name of the parties. What else has to be in a listing agreement? An expiration date. And when a seller signs a listing agreement, they have to be given an Attorney General's memorandum against discrimination. 54, under the Truth in Lending Act, Regulation Z, which of the following items must be noted in a disclosure statement? And it's if there's any mortgage prepayment penalties. These other things, the mortgagee's title insurance fees, remember the mortgagee is the lender. We don't care what the lender's fees are. The mortgage recording fees, That's not part of the loan. And the attorney's fee is not part of the loan. So it's any mortgage prepayment penalties. 55, R and J are purchasing a duplex together. '53 is A, yes. R and J are purchasing a duplex together. They asked the broker how to ensure that in the event of the death of one of them, the dead person's interest will go to their partner who they bought it with, the surviving person. The broker's best response is to tell them, well, they should take it as joint tenancy because then the dead person's share goes to the other co-owner. But that's really a restrictive form of ownership, so they should discuss the details with an attorney. So they should consider taking it in joint tenancy, and they should consider doing that only after they've talked to an attorney. So we're actually at halfway point now. So take a second. A lot of questions. That's the hardest part of taking the test, is it's so hard to concentrate for that many questions. A tenant has a 5-year lease on a property that's being taken by eminent domain. He has 3 years left on his lease. What happens? He has to be compensated for the interruption of his lease. My friends owned Scorantino's Pizza in Perth Amboy. When the town of Perth Amboy, through eminent domain, took that building so they could build a new city hall, they had to pay Scorantino's for the interruption of their lease. And Scorantino's got so much money from that interruption of that lease that they bought a building in South Amboy. And that's where Scorantino's Pizza is now, in South Amboy.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes.
But other way around, you have a lease and then the property is sold for some reason, and you want to stay. So the new owner, basically the existing lease will be enforced under the same condition. It doesn't matter, you have a new owner. Am I right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And what happens at closing, by the way, is the attorneys issue a letter of attornment. I always get it wrong and say a letter of atonement, but that's a religious thing. So they get a letter of attornement, and the letter of attornement explains to the tenants that their lease is still good, and now here's who they should pay the rent to. Number 57, the highest and best use of a property is described as the use that will. And remember, highest and best use is going to give us the greatest return to the property. The introduction into the marketplace of foreclosed properties from banks and savings and loans that go out of business will probably cause the value of similar properties to fall in the short term. Number 59, a broker would be obligated to inform all of the following individuals of the fiduciary responsibility under the broker's firm, under the law of agency, except. So who do I as a broker not have to tell my buyers about my fiduciary duty? The buyer's lenders. Buyer's lenders is a whole different bird, and they can express what their fiduciary duty is. But subagent brokers, if somebody's a subagent of me, I have a fiduciary duty. Everybody who's on my sales staff has a fiduciary duty, and buyers brokers may or may not have a fiduciary duty, but we still have to tell them of the responsibilities.
Hey, Bruce, there is a buyer's broker, and then there's a broker who has a listing, but the buyer's brokers find the listing. And so which capacity he's reporting to the selling broker? Is he the sub-agent, or is he broker to broker?
He would be a buyer's agent.
Is he the agent?
He would be a buyer's agent.
He would be a buyer's agent.
In a city where rent control restrictions, if the property is improved beyond its current level, the landlord may increase the monthly rent by 1.75%. So we got a guy who did $6,400 worth of improvements. So 6,400 times 0.0175 means that he could raise the rent $112. So under this formula, he would be allowed, because you're going to take 6,400 and multiply it by 0.0175. That's how we write that. And that equals $112. So he's allowed to raise the rent by 112, but he raised it by 120. He went from 840 to 960. So he exceeded rent control by $8. He exceeded rent control by $8. $61, the right to pay off a debt and reclaim the property after the mortgage default, after the sheriff's sale, is called the right of redemption, and it's 10 days. You have a 10-day right of redemption. Under the cost approach, an appraiser has calculated the current replacement cost new of a structure that is 15 years old. The next factor is going to be accrued depreciation, wear and tear, functional obsolescence, and external obsolescence, all part of the cost approach. Here's a question that's always on the test. At a closing that involves the financing of real estate, the mortgagor, the person who is giving the mortgage, that's the borrower, must, and he is going to secure the deed. He is going to secure the deed by signing a mortgage. And I take that back. That is not the right answer, and I don't know how to erase that. So this is not the right answer. The right answer, he is going to secure the note by signing the mortgage. So this is not the right answer. The right answer, he's going to secure the note by signing a mortgage. The securitization or the hypothecation of the note is the mortgage that allows the bank to take the house back if you don't pay them. So the answer to 63 is D. Sorry about that. An individual with ownership interest that involves specific occupancy has a timeshare. Specific occupancy periods. It's a specific period, he has a timeshare. Now, we talked about a right of first refusal before. Right of first refusal, that's only a contractual obligation. But now we're going to talk about a clause in a lease that would give the tenant the contractual right to purchase a leased property at a specific price. That's going to be an option. That's going to be a lease option because it's a specific price. So that's going to be a lease option. $66, at 3 p.m., salesman K receives an offer on one of K's listings from another salesperson. K immediately calls the sellers and arranges to meet with them at 6. At 4:30, a salesperson from a cooperating broker brings another offer. At 5, the office secretary informs K that the third salesperson will be showing the house at 5:30. This is going on every day now. Offers just keep coming in on properties. Everybody says, wait for me. I'm going to have an offer coming in later on. So what are you going to do? You're going to present the offers that you have at the same time because you don't want to give favors to one or another if you have them. When people say they are bringing in an offer, you don't care. Until you have an offer in your hands, it's nothing to you. But in this case, we're going to present both offers at the same time that we already have, and we do not have to wait for the other offer to come in. Might not hurt you to tell the seller that it might be coming, but you're under no obligation to wait. If the person dies intestate with no heirs, intestate means with no will and with no heirs, the state exercises escheat, where it takes the property, the state gets it, and they pay nothing for it. A lot is 2 acres, and it's 100 feet wide. How deep is it? So we have 43,560 times 2, and that's going to tell us how many square feet we have. 43,560 times 2 and that's 87,120. And then we're going to divide it by the 100 feet wide, and that's going to tell us the depth. So our depth is going to be 871.2. 87120 divided by 100 gives us 871.2.
The 43,000 number is the value for 1 acre, right?
Right. And somebody in class
Cool.
a couple of sessions ago came up with, he remembers it by saying 711 because it's 43, that's the 7, 560 is the 11. So he remembers it by saying 711. I don't know if that helped at all. That's always on the test, by the way, is how many square feet in an acre. 43,560. 69, the potential gross income of warehouse is 36,000. The vacancy allowance is 2%. The taxes are $2,000. Maintenance is 3,600. Reserves for replacement is 1,800. Debt service is 13,500, and depreciation is 3,500. So this is testing your math skills and to see if you know what value by income is. So value, didn't want to do that one. Value by income is equal to the NOI divided by the cap rate. And what goes into NOI is the rent, 36,000. And then we're going to subtract 2% from that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say 36,000 times 0.98. That takes away 2%. So that means our effective rent is 35,280. If I take 36,000 and I take away 2%, I have 35,280. And then I'm going to subtract, because we're looking for NOI, I'm going to subtract our taxes, which are 2,000. I'm going to subtract our maintenance, which is 3,600. I'm going to subtract our reserves for replacements, which you can use. Reserves for replacements are part of NOI, but we don't use the debt service and we don't use the depreciation. So we're going to take that number of that 35,280 and we're going to subtract 2,000 and then subtract 3,600 and then subtract 1,800. And that's going to give us 27,880. And then we're going to divide by the cap rate. So it's telling us here the cap rate is 12%. So we divide that by 0.12. And that's going to give us 232,333. 232,333. Value by income. We use that on apartment buildings or warehouses. Things that produce income.
I have another question.
Go ahead.
Earlier you stated not value of income, but for example, if it was a church, it's based on cost. So is it value by cost?
It's called value by the cost approach.
Value by cost approach. And what's the formula for that?
So on the value by cost approach, first thing you're going to do is decide whether you're doing replacement or reproduction. You're doing an exact duplicate or just a building that serves the same purpose. Usually it's the replacement, just a building that serves the same purpose. And then you're going to build an imaginary building that serves the same purpose. And remember, your imaginary building is going to be brand new. So you're going to have to subtract accrued depreciation because your old building here has depreciated. And I don't talk about depreciating for tax purposes. I mean, it has some wear and tear. I mean, it has some things that are functionally obsolete, and it has some things like high tension wires going over it that cause external obsolescence. So you're going to find out what your new imaginary building costs you to build. Then you're going to subtract each of these things. And then you're going to add back in the value of the land because the land didn't change its value in terms of depreciation. So it's not really a mathematical formula as much as it is a series of steps.
Got you. Thank you.
You're welcome. 70, under conditions of climbing inflation, a property manager would be reluctant to negotiate which of the following types of leases, and it would be a fixed rent. He would rather have a graduation rent or an index rent or a reevaluation rent. So if we had inflation, And you know, the Fed is talking about trying to get inflation going again. So when that happens, we'll see you know, people putting graduated rents or revaluation rents in buildings. 71, a lis pendens filed in a foreclosure is a notice of. Lis pendens means lawsuit pending, so it's an impending action. It's an impending action. An individual who sells shares in a limited partnership organized to buy and sell real estate interstate has to have a securities license, a Series 7 license. And it's the limited partnership that requires it, not the interstate. It's the limited partnership that makes it be a securities license, a Series 7 license from the SEC. A clause in a mortgage that allows the lender to declare the loan balance due on default is called an acceleration clause. Instead of having 30 years, it speeds it up and it's all due at once. That's an acceleration clause. By the way, they always have a question about Horbendom clauses on the test. A Horbendom clause is a clause that you find in a deed, and it tells you how much of an estate you have, because Horbendom is Latin for I have. So using the amortization table in the book, what is the monthly payment on a 30-year amortized loan of $235 at 5%? So you're going to go down the 30-year column and over at the 5% row, you're going to get a factor, and you're going to multiply that factor times 235,000 and then divide it by 1,000. Now, I don't know what the answer is here, but I'm going to tell you, if you have a 30-year amortized, fully amortized fixed loan, the answer is not going to be C or D. I don't have the chart in front of me here, so the answer is going to be either A or B. We know that if you're borrowing $235, you're not going to have $126 or $115 payments. So again, what you're going to do is you're going to go to that book, and they're not going to tell you to open your book at the test. They'll give you the chart. You're going to find the chart for 5%, and then you're going to go all the way down the chart to the row that's 30 years. And then where that intersects, it's going to give you a factor, and then you're going to multiply that factor times 235 and then divide it by 1,000. And that'll give you how much your monthly payment is. And I'm sorry, I don't have the book in front of me. 75, a will that has been written entirely in the testator's handwriting is known as a holographic will. And a holographic will is enforceable even without being witnessed, because you can tell whose handwriting it is. Number 76, the sale of a condominium unit is considered the sale of a security. And this is a tough one if the sale involves a mandatory rental pool. So somebody's asking me, if you witness it, does it need to be notarized? I would say it doesn't have to be notarized, but you probably want to get it notarized. It makes it more provable in court. But it could just be witnessed. Again, it's not necessarily the best way. All right, the sale of a condominium unit is considered the sale of a security if it involves a mandatory rental pool. One of my friends has a condo unit in the Manhattan Club in Manhattan, and he gets it for 2 weeks every year. And one of the 2 weeks, he has to put it into the hotel's rental pool. So he doesn't have any control over the unit during that 1 week. That, since he doesn't have any control, it makes it a security. 77, which of the following statements is correct about a sale-leaseback? A sale-leaseback is a financing agreement where the seller becomes the tenant and the buyer becomes the landlord. So the buyer becomes the landlord and the seller becomes a tenant. 78, which of the following regulations permits lending institutions to make their own underwriting decisions? And it's called the Direct Endorsement Program. And I'm not sure if, Eric, if you know, if that's still in effect, if they still allow direct endorsement. I don't know. If you're still allowed to determine what's amenable and what's not amenable. Water and mineral rights to real property are insured by, so, when you own real property, you own what's underneath it. So if you have minerals under it, or if you have water under it, what type of insurance covers that? And it's your title insurance. Because if at some point you have used a deed to give up your mineral rights, then you don't have them anymore. So water and mineral rights are protected by title, T-I-T-L-E, title insurance. Broker K is preparing a closing statement on the sale of a house for $77,000. K has a $1,000 earnest money deposit, and the balance of the buyer's down payment is $16,000. So we see he's got 16 and 1 is 17, so he's borrowing 60. The balance of the purchase price, he's borrowing 60, we know that, will be financed by a new mortgage, and he's paying 2 points. So what's 2 points on 60,000? It's going to be $1,200 is 2 points. 60,000 times 0.02 is $1,200. The seller's broker will receive a 7% commission, and the buyer's going to pay $1,750 in miscellaneous closing costs. Real estate taxes for the calendar year are $1,050 and are due and payable on the last day of December. But they're due and payable, which means they haven't been paid. They're due and payable, which means they haven't been paid. And they're $1,050 for the year. They're going to due on the last day of December. The closing is taking place on June 30th. That means that there's a half a year that the seller is going to have lived in the house without paying the taxes. So there's going to be then a $525 credit. So how much cash will the buyer owe at closing? He's going to owe his $16,000. He's going to owe $1,200. He's going to owe $1,750, and then he's going to get a credit for $525. So if we take 16,000 plus 1,200 plus 1,750 minus 525, he's going to owe 18,425. He's going to owe, and the hardest part about this particular question, is you have to know that that 525 is a credit, because the seller is living in the house for half a year without paying the taxes. That means the buyer is going to pay for those taxes, so he has to get a credit at closing for them. 81, the maximum amount of money that a harmed person can collect from the guarantee fund is $20,000 per claim. How much do you pay into the fund? $10 when you first get licensed, and $20 when you become a broker. After completing a real estate licensing course, you got 1 year to get your license. So when I sign you out, you have 1 year to pass your test, get fingerprinted, and hang your license with a broker. And up until COVID, they were never giving any extensions. So I can't guarantee you they will continue to give extensions, but right now they are giving extensions. Number 83, which of the following needs a real estate license? So we know lawyers, if they're selling a house for a client, they're exempt for just that one client. An executor working under the terms of a will, he gets to charge a commission for selling stuff. So he doesn't have to have a real estate license. And an investor who's got his own rental properties, he doesn't need a real estate license. So who does need one? A son selling a house for his parents for a car. Because what necessitates you having to have a real estate license is getting consideration for selling real estate for another. So he's getting consideration, a car, something of value, in exchange for selling his parents' house. 84, real estate licenses in New Jersey need to be renewed once every 2 years, and they get renewed on June 30th is when they expire on June 30th of odd numbered years. So this June 30th, The new licenses are issued on July 1st of this odd numbered year, and they will run until June 30th of the next odd numbered year, which will be 2023. 85, a rental referral agency says they have an apartment available. They have to check every day to see if it's still available. And remember, a rental referral agency can only take $25 until they've performed the service. So if a rental referral agency charges tenants $50, that's not their money. Only 25 of it is their money. So it has to be deposited in an escrow account because it's not their money until they provide the service, which is to find them an apartment. Number 87, a licensee who is qualified to be a broker but wishes to work for another broker is going to be a broker salesperson. Same requirements to be a broker salesperson as a broker. It's just that if you're a broker salesperson, you're not the real estate agency. The broker you work for is the real estate agency, so you're going to have to work under their license. Number 88, a real estate license is required for, so we know it's not required for the sheriff, so he's working under a court order. We know it's not required for people who sell on their own. We know it's not required for bank and trust companies. They're one of the exceptions. So persons employed on a fee basis by a rental referral agency. If you have your license now and you don't renew it, how long afterwards, which is going to, it would expire on June 30th of this year, how long can it stay before it's dead forever? 2 years. 2 years. Number 90, a real estate broker's license will be issued to everyone except somebody who's 17. The minimum age for a broker's license is 18. How would you get a broker's license at 18? If you came back wounded or disabled from military service, the 3 years experience requirement is waived. So you could come back from Afghanistan with a service wound or disability. You could get your broker's license right away. You don't have to wait till you serve 3 years apprenticeship. 91, when a broker's license is revoked, then all the licenses of the agents in his office are suspended. And they are not suspended as a penalty. They're just suspended until they can go hang them with a different broker whose license has not been revoked. Number 92, for a first violations of the License Act, what can the Real Estate Commission not do? So for the first violation, they could suspend your license. They could revoke your license. They could suspend your license and fine you $200, but what they can't do is fine you $150,000 because for the first violation, the maximum fine is $5,000. Which of the following statements is true with respect to a trust account? Remember, only a broker can have a trust account. And the answer is the trust account must be kept only in an authorized institution. What makes the institution authorized is they promise to let the Real Estate Commission know if I bounce a trust check, if the broker bounces a trust check. 94, for which of the following crimes does the New Jersey Real Estate Commission have the power to promptly revoke the license of an agent awaiting trial? And it's forgery. That's one of those ones that automatically, forgery, burglary, theft by deception, that automatically allows them to revoke your license while you're awaiting trial. The rest of them, they can revoke your license after you're convicted. You do have an obligation to let the Real Estate Commission know if you've been charged with a crime within 30 days. Broker P listed case property for sale under an exclusive right to sell agreement. One of P's salespeople obtained an offer to purchase it with a certified check for 5% of the purchase price as earnest money. What should the salesperson T do with the check? Well, he's got to give the check to his broker to go into the trust account. So give the money to P, because P is the broker, and it has to go into the broker's trust account. 96, a broker violated real estate law when his office was in the home of a salesperson employed by that broker. Remember, you could have a office in the broker's own home if it had a separate entrance and had separate living quarters from the brokerage quarters, but you can't have a broker's office in a broker salesperson's home or a salesperson's home. 97. So a real estate salesperson may. So what can he do? He can prepare a sales contract for a 4-family home. He cannot work for more than one broker at a time. He cannot have his own escrow account. He cannot be compensated by anyone except his employing broker. So what can he do? Prepare a sales contract for a 4-family home. Again, we're allowed to prepare contracts for 1 to 4 family homes, condos and co-ops, single lots. Everything else has to be done with a letter of intent, and the attorneys prepare the contracts. Okay, we can sell anything, but we can only prepare contracts on 1 to 4 family homes, condos, co-ops, single lots. Brokers are required to deposit funds of others received in an escrow transaction within 5 business days. We talked about that a minute ago. 99, commingling refers to the mixing of broker funds and trust funds. Now, we are allowed as a broker to put small amounts of money into the trust account to maintain minimum balances or to pay my fees to Bank of America, who charges me $18 a month from my trust account. Number 100, if a broker has no agency, which means fiduciary duties, then the broker is acting as a transaction broker. He has no fiduciary duties, no agency duties. He is a transaction broker. 101, all of the following are included in the bundle of rights, except the right of survivorship. Right of survivorship is the right that allows joint tenants with rights of survivorship for the dead person's share to go to the surviving live person. But the rest of these, A, B, and C, are all in the bundle of rights. 102, emblements are personal property. Crops and emblements are crops. They are personal property by the doctrine of fructus industrial, which means they are the person who planted them's personal property because they are indeed the fruit, fructus industrial, of their labor. So they're the personal property because of fructus industrial. Non-homogeneity, that means when things are not the same. Remember, there is a principle of value called the principle of conformity, which says the highest value is achieved when all things are the same. So non-homogeneity is physical characteristics that refer to uniqueness. If that particular property is not the same as all the others, it's unique. 104, a transaction broker, remember from the other question above, has no fiduciary duties. So a transaction broker is not a fiduciary because they have no fiduciary duties. Now, this is a weird one that is always on the test. A real estate licensee who has listed a property, he's going to be a special agent to the seller and a general agent of the broker. He's a special agent of the seller because of the listing agreement, and he is a general agent of the broker because of his employment agreement. So a real estate licensee who has listed a property is a special agent to the seller and a general